First, the billionaire owner of the Los Angeles Times blocked the editorial board's plans to endorse Democrat Kamala Harris for president. Then, Mariel Garza, the paper's editorials editor, resigned in protest. Others followed. Thousands of subscriptions were canceled. The following day, the Washington Post announced it also would not make an endorsement for the White House. Here's NBC News.
The Post's owners, billionaire Jeff Bezos, defending the decision, saying presidential endorsements create a, quote, perception of bias. The fallout has brought job resignations, subscription cancellations. NPR reporting that over 200,000 readers have canceled their subscriptions since Friday. It's also sparking a debate over whether newspapers or their editorial boards should be endorsing in the first place.
The Post constantly reported that Trump was bad for democracy, and that was good for its business. However, since the Republican left office, the paper has lost tens of millions of dollars a year and seen the size of its audience greatly diminish. This is Puck's News' Dylan Byers.
In the first Trump administration, the Washington Post decided to be the democracy dies in darkness resistance newspaper, and that was a very good business with progressives, liberals, people who weren't behind Trump. I think Jeff Bezos now is trying to position his paper as a paper that Republicans can buy too.
Expanding readership sounds harmless, but is there something more? Newly resigned editor-at-large Robert Kagan said this to CNN.
This is obviously an effort by Jeff Bezos to curry favor with Donald Trump in the anticipation of his possible victory. Trump has threatened to go after Bezos' business. Bezos runs one of the largest companies in America. They have tremendously intricate relations with the federal government. They depend on the federal government. And Trump has made it clear that he will attack media organizations that are critical of him.
Our guest joining us from New York is Sewell Chan, the executive editor of Columbia Journalism Review. Hello to you, Sewell. Thank you for speaking to Scoop. There's a lot of confusion about how papers can make political endorsements, but also attest to being impartial. Could you explain this, first of all, to our viewers?
Yes, of course. It is a bit of a quirk, one might say, in the U.S. newspaper tradition, that the news side is supposed to be impartial, neutral. Both sides are supposed to be accurate and precise, of course, but the news side is expected to be impartial, objective, if you will, whereas the opinion side, traditionally the editorial board, very much the case today, but it's come under tension because unlike in the print product where the opinion section and the news sections are clearly delineated, online it can be very confusing. So I'm sympathetic to the notion that endorsements might confuse readers and might lead them astray, and might cause them to wonder whether the news side is truly impartial. However, the manner in which these presidential endorsements were killed at both the Washington Post and the LA Times is what has caused so much consternation.
Right, and we'll get to that in a moment. Yesterday, the Washington Post, though, ran this cartoon, so I'll read it to you since you can't see it on air. It said, quote, "So the columnists have the freedom to state their opinion in the paper, but object to the right of the guy who owns the paper to have his." Is that a fair point?
I think that is a very fair point indeed, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos has his own First Amendment rights, but of course one would argue that his institutional obligations to the Washington Post and to its readers, perhaps outweigh, his own individual perspective. I mean, he did write his own op-ed. He wrote his own column saying why he decided to spike the endorsement, to kill the endorsement, but it was not very satisfying to most people who read it.
Yeah, Sewell, you worked at both the LA Times and the Washington Post. You've reported on these stories. Take us inside that Post decision. How did the newsroom, how did the editorial board find out?
Well, they found out very abruptly, right? I mean, there have been weeks of discussion, and the editorial had been drafted, as I've reported. People were really hoping that it would run. There had been a sign from the opinion editor that, in fact, it would run, and then came the decision very abruptly, again, less than 2 weeks before Election Day, saying that it would not run after all. And so that's I think the timing of it, and frankly the lack of communication, notwithstanding Bezos' subsequent column, I think that's the combination of the two things is what disturbed people the most.
Yeah, it's subsequent decorum. Is this what you're referring to? Now, Bezos defended this, saying Americans don't trust the media. But then executives from his space company, Blue Origin, met with Donald Trump on the same day that the Washington Post prevented its editorial team from publishing that endorsement. Does that inspire trust?
Well, you could very much argue it does not. I mean, the Bezos' people have said that the Blue Origin meeting was something I think he wasn't even aware of. So I don't think it was some coordinated effort. But I think the larger picture, and to viewers in France and elsewhere, the spectacle of someone who's one of the richest people on earth, has gigantic investments not only in Amazon, web services, artificial intelligence, now space exploration, all of which are topics that there's a lot of federal regulation in, also owning the major newspaper in the nation's capital. For many people, it just seems like too much, and that's why some people have urged Bezos to either sell the paper or transfer it to a nonprofit, arguing that just, even if he tries as hard as he can, it's going to be unavoidable to have conflicts of interest.
Yeah, and Sewell, one of the aspects of your job and mine is to spot trends. We have the LA Times, we have the Washington Post. They're not alone. Gannett, the owner of the nation's largest newspaper chain, announced that it's more than 200 publications, including USA Today, one of the top 5 circulations in America, will not be publishing presidential endorsements. What message does this send?
Well, it depends how you view it. I do think that I'm trying to make a subtle point here because I do think that there is a legitimate argument to say that newspaper endorsements, particularly at the presidential level, don't have much impact and might confuse readers. So if a publication decides to stop doing presidential endorsements, I actually think there's a potential argument for it. I don't think the way to do that is weeks before the election with an endorsement already drafted. And I think that's what's very, very unfortunate here. Bezos presented his decision as one of policy, i.e. the Post is not going to endorse for president, again, at least while he's owner. But again, the better way to have done that would have been to announce that policy 2 years ago or to wait until after the election. I do think endorsements can be very useful, especially useful at the state and local level. In particular, for local races where there's not much media coverage and people are trying to figure out who to vote for or what are the relative merits of candidates, especially for less high-profile races.
Yeah. Now, we saw Mariela Garza resign from the LA Times. Others followed. There were also resignations at the Washington Post. Some people were wondering, should they have perhaps stayed on, published the endorsement, and forced the paper to fire them afterward? What do you make of that?
Well, that's a very interesting theory. I think it would be very, first of all, on the web especially, you can take things down that have been published. So I'm not sure that something so reckless as seizing the means of production would have been necessarily very wise. So I don't think that's a very practical idea.
Yeah, I think we're up to about 250,000 subscriptions canceled for the Washington Post at this point. People angry after this decision. Is this the right form of protest? Does this harm the newsroom, or does it send a message to Jeff Bezos?
Well, I think a message has been sent. I personally believe that subscription cancellations are not the right form of protest for the simple reason that it's hurting the journalists ultimately, and they're the ones who deserve our support. So you're asking my personal opinion, and that is that I've maintained my subscriptions, not because I approve necessarily of the decision that the owners have made at the LA Times and Washington Post, but rather because I want to support the important work the journalists are doing.
All right. Thank you very much, Sewell Chan, Columbia Journalism Review's executive editor. Thank you for speaking to Scoop this week.
My pleasure.
That brings us to our quote of the week. It comes from the Post editorialist Karen Attiah, who had urged readers not to cancel their subscriptions because it would hurt good journalists and not the billionaire owner. In her column, she wrote, quote, "An independent news organization does not mean silent. As misinformation, confusion, dissonance, anxiety, and anger spread through America, the Washington Post must be a beacon. The way democracy dies in darkness is if journalism is left to die in cowardice." End quote. I should point out that phrase, democracy dies in darkness, is the official slogan of the Washington Post. That's it for Scoop this week. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned to France 24.